Mr. President, to state the obvious, the Senate has begun debate on a proposed amendment to the Constitution, and this is, as it ought to be, a solemn moment in the life of our Constitution. For what we debate today, and I expect in the following weeks, is whether to change or to alter, to modify the basic document of governance that we've operated under. Since 1791, the year the Bill of Rights was ratified, members of Congress have introduced over 10,000 proposed amendments to the Constitution. Admittedly, the new Republican majority is making their weight felt here. We have not only this amendment, but I don't know how many more to amend the Constitution. But there have been over 10,000 proposed amendments to our Constitution. Of those 10,000, we in Congress have approved just 22, and of the 22, just 17 have been ratified by 3/4 of the states and have become part of the Constitution. We stand here again this year confronting one of our most profound constitutional responsibilities as we consider a change in our fundamental charter. It is one of the glories of the United States Constitution that it's been so resilient. Its authors' insight into human behavior and political institutions have proved accurate from our early years as an outpost on the coast of the New World to our current status of a space-age superpower. Few changes have been necessary to permit the Constitution to keep pace with our social, economic, and technological revolutions that have transformed our nation since its founding. But in recent decades, we've faced a problem we don't seem to be able to solve. We can't balance our budget, or more correctly, we will not. And to put it in even sharper focus, I think it's much less important that our budget be balanced. There's nothing magic about the budget being balanced. But what is critically important is our deficit continue to decline and that we have a small deficit, if any deficit at all. At the beginning of the Reagan administration, we swerved from the course that had, since the end of World War II, shrunk the national debt, and we turned onto a path that has led us to where we are today, in the so-called Laffer curve. Speaking of Laffers, it's probably the ultimate Laffer, is the Laffer curve. Many of us have worked to impose disciplines needed to restrain the temptation to spend beyond what we tax. When the Reagan administration deficits began, I proposed, along with Senator Grassley, and he mentioned this earlier, and Senator Kassebaum, that we freeze every single solitary program in the government, that anything the government had to do with, every single solitary one, that we not spend a penny more, not even accounting for inflation, than we spent the year before. Although I wrote the plan with my two Republican colleagues, we received very little support from either side of the aisle. I think our high water mark 3 years later was 38 votes. I also supported the Graham-Rudman process. It has been much maligned here in the Congress. It has not worked, but I would argue absent Graham-Rudman, things would even be worse than they are today. That put caps on the amount of deficits allowed and required a balanced budget, but the requirements changed every year, and the only constant in the process was the annual increase in the national debt and the guarantee of annual deficits. Those aren't the only things that we've tried. From the point over 10 years ago when I offered my own constitutional amendment to balance the federal budget, which you might expect me to say, parenthetically, I think is a superior document to then the one we're about to vote on this year, up to my vote for Senator Reid's balanced budget amendment last year. I've held that this is an issue worthy of constitutional consideration. Many suggest that this is not an issue worthy of constitutional consideration. Well, the fact of the matter is, I think my friend from Illinois is correct when he keeps quoting and referencing Jefferson. If this is not worthy of constitutional consideration, how we are able to bind or not bind future generations, I'm not sure what is worthy of constitutional consideration. That in no way undercuts the opposing argument that writing fiscal policy into a constitution or into a document of governments governance is a difficult and maybe impossible thing. But the notion that this is not worthy of constitutional consideration, I think, is not accurate. The decision to encumber future generations with financial obligations is one that can rightly be considered among the fundamental choices addressed in the Constitution. But from the first time the resolution before us here today was proposed, I've been concerned that it could bring with it problems that, taken together, could be almost as bad as the deficit problem that we are all worried about. In the Judiciary Committee, I've described some of those concerns. This year in committee, a number of amendments were offered to fix what I perceive to be, at least, problems in this resolution, this constitutional amendment. Some of us tried to make this a better proposal, and we tried to avoid tying up the courts with constitutional questions about such important details as the President's role in enforcing the balanced budget. We tried to keep the Social Security Trust Fund off budget, where it is now and where it should stay. We tried to assure that the real cost of the balanced budget amendment, and not just its surface allure, are known to the citizens who will be asked to ratify this amendment in coming months. We tried to provide a capital budget to treat public investments the way families, businesses, and states treat their own investments. And these and other amendments were not accepted. And the reason they weren't accepted, and you'll hear it repeatedly, my friend from Utah has referenced it, and it's the one thing that worries me most about this. I'm one of those, quote, undecided votes. There are, I'm told, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of us in this place who do not oppose the notion that we have a mechanism in the Constitution to deal with deficits, but are very unsure of this mechanism. The camps generally divide into 2 areas. One who suggests that this is bad policy, period, to put anything in the Constitution, and those who suggest this is the only answer. I am with a handful, or maybe a couple handfuls of people here who find myself believing that it is not inappropriate, but believing that what we have before us may not do the job. Sometimes I've been here long enough to realize that there are often the unintended consequences of our actions sometimes are worse than the problem we've attempted to cure. So where do we stand now? We have before us the balanced budget amendment, about which many of us have expressed serious reservations, the effects of which are, in both the short and the long term, cannot be predicted with any degree of certainty, although we'll find plenty of people on the floor who will predict with certainty how this will work. I think any reasonable person, though, will acknowledge that it's almost impossible to predict with a degree of certainty what will happen if this passes. I hope that we can improve the proposal by adopting amendments that will be offered here and debated. But there's a second refrain you'll hear on the floor, I expect, time and time again. This is the best we could do. This is the best we could do. We have to pass exactly what the House sent to us because we've never been so close before. We have to take what's before us. For example, I will, in my statement, the opening statement here, before us. For example, I will, in my statement, the opening statement here, make reference to some governors and others who have suggested that a capital budget's a good idea. When I ask people why it's a bad idea, the senator from Illinois gives me his well-thought-out rationale why it's not necessary or why it's counterproductive. But most people look to me and say, well, we can't fool with this. We can't tamper with this because it's the only game in town now. We're getting perilously close, and we can't change anything at all. I would respectfully suggest that's not a very enlightened way to deal with amending the Constitution. I cannot say that I'm optimistic that the improvements, from my perspective, improvements that I and others will suggest will be accepted. And I fear that there are those who will believe that the mere fact that some of us, or speak for myself, will suggest improvements, that's really designed to kill the amendment. The truth of the matter is it's designed to make it better. I, again, will speak to specific changes I'd like to see, but I will argue at every point that any of the changes I've suggested would not in any way undermine the principle of this amendment and would make it more workable, not less workable. Whether or not we amend this amendment, Mr. President, this balanced budget amendment may in fact change our ways. Perhaps we'll use the opportunity of a constitutional constraint and make the tough choices to restore sobriety to our budget process. I devoutly hope so. Of course, it may be that we will decide that the economic and political cost of annual budget balance are not worth the benefits. It may be that we will make use of both the legitimate escape clauses in this amendment and others, unforeseen devices to evade the intent of the amendment. Mr. President, I hope we do not if this passes. Now, we, quite frankly, cannot be sure that a vote for this amendment will have the effect the authors promise. But we can be sure that if we try nothing, we will remain on the path that we've been on for too many years now, with a notable exception in the last 3 years under the leadership of this president. Now, I know, all Democrats are big spenders and all Republicans are conscientious with the taxpayers' dollars. Obviously, history does not support that conclusion. Just if we had not had the Reagan budgets that we all voted on, I mean, we could have stopped them. But if we not had the Reagan budgets and that unusual theory of the Laffer curve, we would have a budget in balance right now just because of the interest accumulated and the debt that's occurred as a consequence of those Reagan additional deficits. I shouldn't say Reagan, the Reagan and the Democratic Congress, both. But we'll hear a good deal of hyperbole on this amendment, promises by those that it's going to cure all, and promises by those, if it passes, that we're going to go to hell in a handbasket and rapidly, and all our liberties will be taken from us. I hope we kind of keep our eye on the ball here and at least have an open mind to the prospect that we can make this amendment better and still have an amendment. We will continue to add every year to the debt burden of future generations. We'll steal today from the future, squeezing out the savings and investments that could increase our future wealth if we don't do something about stopping the size of these deficits, even if we don't balance the budget, if we don't make a remarkable change in the debt accumulated. The senator from Iowa pointed out, I think I heard him say, I would stand to be corrected, but I think he said in 1969, the last time we balanced the budget, every tax dollar collected 6 cents or thereabouts went to pay interest on the debt, and every tax dollar collected in 1993 or 94, I forget which year he used, maybe it was 91, but anyway, every tax dollar collected in the last year or so, 29 cents, I believe was the number he gave, or 26 cents, goes just to pay interest on the debt. I'm sure someone has looked out over the next 15 years and concluded if we stay on the track, even the one predicted by the President of the United States, that we will be providing for an increasingly larger share of every tax dollar just to go to reduce interest on the debt. And to me, that's the driving force behind this amendment. To me, the beginning, middle, and end is not whether there's a magic about having a balanced budget amendment. It's not whether or not there's any magic about it being actually in balance. It's not whether or not we come close. It's about that increasingly larger proportion of the tax dollars collected going for the most useless investment of paying interest on the debt. When I introduced the budget freeze years ago, the liberals in my party said, "It's an awful thing you're doing, Joe. You are all the programs we care about. You're freezing them. Money for the blind, the disabled, education, and so on." And my argument then is the one I make now, which is the strongest, most compelling reason to be for this amendment or an amendment. And that is that if we don't do that, all the things I care most about are going to be gone. Gone. So what do we have? We end up with essentially a net reduction in the programs that I cared about over the last 10 years, a net increase in other programs, and a net increase in the portion of the budget that goes to pay interest on the debt. So the people I care most about, the reason I run for public office in the first place, are the people that got hurt the most in this process and are likely to get hurt the most because they're the weakest in our society. The idea that the interest groups of the PTAs are going to come down here to continue to support money for education versus money for tax expenditures for major businesses, I have no doubt who's going to win that fight. I have no doubt how that's going to turn out. So we'll continue to tie our hands and our ability, indeed our responsibility, to set national priorities in our annual budget process because of the interest on the debt required to be paid every year. This year, the interest on the national debt will cost us $235 billion. The entire discretionary budget will be $253 billion. Now, we use phrases like that, discretionary budget, and my staff writes that stuff in, and I keep telling them nobody in the world but people in this chamber and in the Beltway know what discretionary budget means. Let me translate. That's everything from the FBI to education, from help for the mentally retarded to the Library of Congress. That's everything. Everything out there that people think is the place where we're wasting money, that people think is the place we can cut to cut the deficit. Doesn't include Social Security. It does not include Medicare. It doesn't include entitlement programs. It doesn't include interest on the debt. The point is, it's all those things that everybody, when I go home, says, Joe, if you just cut the waste in government, if we shut down every department in the government, we would in effect have an inability to balance the budget in the out years, because we're already talking about interest on the debt equaling almost the same amount of money of all the money we spend on the government for what the average person thinks are government expenditures. They don't usually think of Social Security as a government expenditure. They don't think of the things that we generally talk about as the big ticket items here as expenditures. By the time this amendment is intended to become law in the year 2002, interest on our debt will be $344 billion, larger than every other category in the budget except Social Security. That's just interest on the debt. If we do nothing, our inability to control the growth of debt and the cost of carrying that debt will tie our hands, preventing us from shifting resources to meet changing needs, which is the essence, in my view, of responsible budgeting, responsible government. So, Mr. President, the question before us today and for the future weeks is not the simple one, are you for balancing the budget or not? Under most circumstances, everyone would agree that we should balance our books. No, it seems to me, Mr. President, the question is, does our repeated failure to balance the budget necessitate a response that all of us agrees is extraordinary, and that is amending the Constitution? It is by no means clear that the amendment before us will eliminate deficits. It certainly will make deficits more difficult, which in and of itself is a worthy undertaking. But with 3/5 vote, we can in fact continue to borrow. And I hope no one is under the delusion that by hook or by crook, some future Congress, less virtuous than we, can find ways around restrictions in this amendment. With little faith in human nature but a healthy respect for human ingenuity, we should have no delusions on that count. I think both the supporters and the opponents of this amendment, quite frankly, overstate the case, though. I expect the supporters of this balanced budget amendment will, as they already have, proclaim it as a panacea that will cure the structural deficit in a way that democratically elected legislatures weighs fiscal responsibility against the demands of their constituents and comes out with a balanced budget. They will proclaim its passage at the end, as the end of deficit spending. The opponents of this amendment may agree that it will drastically change our government, but they will argue for the worse. I expect they will describe the pain that deep cuts will cause to the American people, the elderly, the poor, the military, the farmers, and the rest who depend on government, and paint a bleak picture of life under a balanced budget regime. I say to my colleagues on both sides of this debate that all these claims overstate the case. This amendment will not magically cause deficits to disappear. The hard work of cutting must still be done, and it should be done by us. I mean, evidence the fact that everybody acknowledges that the president's budget package reduced the deficit. Yet everyone went out last year and ran on this gigantic tax increase. It increased it only for the very wealthy. Middle-class taxpayers paid no more. They, in fact, got reductions in some cases, and those were lower middle-class income taxpayers with children, they got an actual reduction in their taxes. But yet, this horrible thing we did, which touched the top 1% of all the taxpayers in America in any meaningful way, that was so horrible and so bad, even though, by the way, in that same document the president said, and we voted, that we would freeze spending. We'd freeze spending in all these other categories. The other side couldn't even muster up the courage to give one single solitary vote for that, reducing the budget deficit by $500 billion over the out years, the immediate year and on out. And the deficit went down. It actually went down. Yet, we talk about if they couldn't muster the courage for that vote, which obviously cost a lot politically, because if you notice, there's fewer desks on this side of the aisle than there are on that side of the aisle now. Obviously, they were right politically anyway. The fact of the matter is, he couldn't muster the courage for that vote. How are we going to find over $1 trillion to cut? I mean, this is incredible. It's incredible the degree of self-delusion you will see us all engage in over the next couple days, the next couple weeks. Nor will this amendment turn democratically elected officials in Congress, as the opponents say, into hard-hearted authoritarians who will ignore the cries of their constituents. That's what my friends opposed to this amendment basically say. Under this amendment, the economy will falter and need shoring up. That's going to happen no matter what we pass. Anyone tell me that this amendment's going to take us out of the cycles we've been in for the past 200 years, particularly the past 60 years? The economy will falter at some point, and it will need shoring up. Foreign dictators will rattle their swords and will be called upon to respond by spending billions of dollars to send armies somewhere. Rains will fall and planes will flood, and federal disaster relief will be called for to the tunes of billions of dollars. I remember it was my friend from Illinois section of the country when he and others were in here pleading that we should continue to reroute the Mississippi and every other river in America, and we should reimburse people for that disaster. And most of us stepped up to the ball and helped. Now our friends in the West Coast are accurately pointing out that there's billions of dollars worth of damage because of earthquakes and fires and floods and rains. Are they going to stop? Is anyone going to suggest that this balanced budget amendment is going to send a message to God as well and say, okay, God, we balanced our budget, now you hold off from here on? Our population will age, and the need to support the medical and social needs of those who supported us when we needed it will not diminish. It's going to grow. Costs will grow. And on and on and on and on. I predict that from time to time, perhaps more frequently, 3/5 of us in Congress will agree that some need of our people is so great that we'll agree that this year we will not balance the budget, or this year we will screw up the courage to have people pay for what they say they want through the tax code. I realize that's a horrible thing to suggest. I always find it kind of interesting. Everything that we hear about the balanced budget, with notable exception of my friend from Illinois and a few others are the chief sponsors of this, always in the terms of cut spending. I mean, whatever happened to that old conservative discipline about paying for what you spend? Paying for what you spend. I thought that meant that if you spend, then you ought to tell people how much it's going to cost to spend. If they don't want us to spend, then we shouldn't spend. But if they want to spend, we should be honest enough to tell them what it's going to cost. Which brings me to the point of what is being offered here, suggested here, is just a sham on the part of the opponents of the balanced budget amendment, saying, tell us how it's going to work. Well, I'm not an opponent of that amendment, but I want to tell you it doesn't seem to be unrealistic for someone to lay out, at least in broad details, how it's going to work. Those say, well, wait a minute, if you're against the balanced budget amendment, you ought to say how to balance it. Most people who are against the balanced budget amendment aren't saying that we have to balance the budget. They're saying that our budget should be somewhere around 19% of GMP, that we shouldn't put ourselves in the position where we're out of whack. They argue, like many economists, most economists argue, that balancing the budget in and of itself is not a sacred undertaking and could be counterproductive. But it seems to me that we should tell the American people. I look at the polls out there. For example, I want to go on record. I'm up for re-election this year, and I'm going to remind everybody what I did at home, which is going to cost me politically. When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid. I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government. And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a third time, and I tried it a fourth time. Somebody has to tell me in here how we're going to do this hard work without dealing with any of those sacred cows, some deserving more protection than others. I'm not quite sure how you get from here to there, but I am sure that we should tell the American people straight up that such an amendment is going to require some big changes. The balanced budget amendment will not end our deficit in one fell swoop, and it will cause our nation, nor will it cause our nation to turn its back overnight on those who depend on us. All it means is, the one thing the senator from Utah said, we'll have to stand up more often and be counted on these things. I find that a good thing, not a bad thing. As we begin this debate, let's keep a decent perspective on the true consequences of this amendment. It's important that we not overstate nor overpromise what the amendment will do. Let's debate this amendment with all the seriousness that a constitutional amendment requires to ensure that the amendment we propose to the states and the American people merits the honor of being included in our most fundamental covenant of self-rule. So what then are the concerns that many of us, those so-called undecided voters, bring to this debate? First, and perhaps foremost, it seems to me we must examine whether the amendment is likely to shift the balance of power between the branches of the government to an extent never experienced or expected by our forefathers. It was the wise position of the drafters of the Constitution in 1789, that the Congress, being the most representative branch, the most democratic and the most sensitive to, and ironically, that's why we're needing this amendment. Everybody should not lose source of that. It's interesting. We go out there and say the Congress is not responsive, and that's one of the things. We should be more responsive to the people. And then we're told the reason we need this amendment is we are too responsive to the people. Whatever they come and ask for, we say, and we give it to them in a painless way. It's kind of fascinating how we sort of turn these arguments to whatever benefit at the moment it allows us. But the fact of the matter is, we are the most representative branch. We do respond to the people, and that's how we were supposed to respond based on what our founders intended, and that we are the most democratic and most sensitive to the public needs. And because of all that, they spent a lot of time debating this little point, on the second floor, because they didn't want a debate to take place on the first floor up there in Philadelphia. They were afraid people would eavesdrop and hear what they were doing. This was before Government in the Sunshine, the Constitutional Convention. They sat upstairs on the second floor so people couldn't walk by and eavesdrop. And what they were saying on the second floor was, hey, look, if we're going to give the power to tax and to spend, we better give it to the outfit that is going to most directly respond to the people. And by the way, taxes, we're going to give it to those guys in the House that get elected every 2 years. We don't even want those senators who weren't even popularly elected in those days to be able to do that. They can only respond to a tax bill proposed by the House. So there was a real solid reason why, in the balance of power, taxing and spending was put into Congress. James Madison, recognized as the father of the Constitution, called this power of the purse, quote, the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure, end of quote. That power of the purse strings has remained with the Congress for over 200 years. This amendment threatens to take away a good deal of that power and to share it with the President, a fundamental shift of authority that will irretrievably alter the balance of power established in the Constitution. And how? So you might say, well, yeah, that sounds good, Biden, but how in fact does this amendment threaten to shift power to the President? Well, because I'm convinced presidents will seize on the language of this amendment to claim a constitutional power to impound, that is, to refuse to spend money that Congress has duly appropriated. This power to impound would give the President wide-ranging authority to undo or redo Congress's spending priorities without limits, or at least so a president would claim. Now you say, no president will do that, Joe, and as a Democrat, I'm happy that this guy downtown is of my party. I'm sure he wouldn't do that. But let me just ask you, what do you think Nixon did? What do you think old Lyndon Johnson would have done? What do you think Franklin Roosevelt would have done with this power? Now, maybe we're not going to have any more Roosevelts, I hope that's not true, or Johnsons or Nixons, but we just may very well. And what does it mean? It means that the President could decide to change the way that Congress had allocated funds in spending bills. For example, taking away money to ensure that ensures that small states get their fair share. Now let me be parochial for a moment. I'm a senator from Delaware, one of the smallest states in the Union, the fifth smallest population in the Union. We always, when we pass bills here to make sure that all Americans benefit, whether they live in New Hampshire or Delaware or Utah or Wyoming or Alaska or other small states, we sit and we make sure the formulas we write into this don't let all of the money go just on a per capita basis. Now, we usually get together, and there's probably somewhere between 18 and 20 of us, that is states, who find themselves in that position. Well, you know, the President gets to the end of the line here, the budget's not in balance, we have not passed a balanced budget, because I might add, we're not going to know whether or not this is going to be in balance as we go along, because it is predicated upon predicted revenues. So we spend based on predicted revenues. That doesn't count emergencies, that doesn't count significant downturns in the economy, that doesn't count a lot of other things that come into play. At the end of the line, we end up with passing a budget we thought was in balance, but in fact is out of balance. That means the President, arguably under this, could say, well, that's my job now, I'm going to redo this. Well, I know what I'd do if I were President and I wanted to get this thing moving. I'd pick off the smallest states and cut the monies that was allocated for them. Because they're the least powerful. In Congress, they can't do much. They don't have that many representatives. And over here, because we make up a minority, we might find ourselves in difficulty. Now, maybe they wouldn't do that, but it would be able to be done. The President could change detailed policy set by Congress. He could conclude on his own that Congress put, for example, too many military bases in South Carolina or Kansas, or too much medical treatment in Utah or Mississippi. Do we really want to give the President that kind of power? I think not. Along with this power to spend, according to Walter Dellinger, a noted constitutional scholar and now the President's top constitutional advisor, this amendment could even be construed to give the President the power to levy taxes, to raise needed revenues. Now, I think that's much more unlikely, quite frankly, although it is arguably possible. Do we want to give the President that kind of power? Well, I don't think we do. In committee, I supported Senator Kennedy in offering an amendment to make it absolutely clear that the balanced budget amendment is not intended to shift to the President a major piece of Congress's historical power to tax and spend. Not a single one of my colleagues that I'm aware of disagreed with the point of the amendment. Nobody disagreed with the point of the amendment. Some said not to worry, it can't happen, or it probably won't happen, or it's unlikely to happen. But everyone acknowledged that if it happened, it would be a bad thing. And yet, a majority, all the Republicans and a couple Democrats, voted in bloc to defeat this amendment, claiming it was not necessary, that after-the-fact legislation could take care of the problem, the so-called enabling legislation. Well, I'd sure like to know that before we pass this. I'd like to know whether or not a president can do that. Why don't we just make it clear that Congress has to resolve any discrepancy that's left at the end? Say the Congress just says you have to pro rata reduce the rest of the budget, whatever mechanism, but the Congress, not the President. Now, maybe that's what the Congress will do. Maybe the President won't reach. But I have never seen, as a student of history, any time where there is a vacuum in power that's created that the administration, Democrat or Republican, has not stepped in to fill the vacuum. And I've seen very few times when the Congress, on its own volition, has stepped up to the ball to fill a vacuum when filling the vacuum would require them to make hard decisions. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that that future presidents may seek this authority. Not necessary? Well, I say that a principle as important as preserving the balance of powers should be stated as plainly and boldly as possible in the balanced budget amendment itself. Now, again, as we debate this and we get to it, I will be happy to hear anyone say that the president should have that power. I suspect everyone's going to say he should not, and this amendment doesn't give it to him. Well, if that's true, what's the big deal of including it in the amendment? It is not unartful. It can be artfully done. It does not ruin the symmetry of the amendment. It does not go to the heart of whether we have to balance the amendment. It merely says we're not going to shift the balance of power, no doubt about it. Our Constitution, that durable and flexible document, has endured for over 200 years. The chief reason it has endured is because the self-correcting checks and balances that have kept one branch from dominating the other have been maintained. In the days to come, I will support, if not offer, efforts to modify this amendment to ensure that in addressing this important issue, we do not risk undoing 200 years of history. The second concern that I have is not a constitutional one. It is a very practical one, but no less important for that fact. The balanced budget amendment makes no provision for a capital budget to pay for long-term capital improvements. This amendment will require the federal government to pay for capital improvements, roads, bridges, schools, aircraft carriers, all of which are designed to last for decades on a pay-as-you-go basis. Now, this is not the way states or local governments or our families or businesses, for that matter, treat these sorts of long-term items. No, all of these recognize that it is permissible, even prudent, to go into debt to pay for long-term items such as a house, a factory, or a road or an aircraft carrier. State and local governments that are required to balance their budgets every year are permitted by their balanced budget rules to set up capital budgets. They are permitted to borrow money to pay for long-term capital items, even though they must balance the rest of their budget. Now, we hear the term used all the time, states do this, why can't we do it? States do not do this. If you look at the numbers, the total accumulated debt of the states over a comparable period for the federal government over the last 2 decades, the states have increased debt more rapidly than the federal government, almost a 2-to-1 margin. So before you get on the floor and pound your chest about how your state balances budget, say, how would your state balance this budget if it had the same exact amendment as this? Now, some states may. Mine doesn't. Mine's a little tighter, quite frankly. But we're smaller and we're more manageable. Most states who have balanced budget amendments do not, in fact, balance their budgets. They have a capital budget, which allows them to go in debt. I believe the federal government should have the same ability to borrow to pay for capital items as state and local governments do, and that we should amend the balanced budget amendment to assure that we give proper weight to our long-term needs. Now, I'm not alone in this view. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, that bastion of conservative thought, has criticized the balanced budget amendment because it lacks such a capital budget. Here's what the Wall Street Journal had to say. Quote, to understand the economics, start here, referring to the balanced budget amendment. Start here. If all American households were required to balance their budgets every year, no one would ever buy a house. Of course, households don't think about their budgets that way. They figure balance means meeting their mortgage payments. Similarly, state and local governments with balanced budget requirements can still borrow money for capital improvements. So lest everyone here in the gallery, as they walk out and say, we balance our budget, why doesn't the federal government do it the way we do? Well, unless you're a very wealthy person, even then it would be not good economics for you to do it this way. Unless you paid cash for your house and paid cash for your car, you don't balance your budgets. You don't balance your budgets like this amendment requires to be balanced. I want the federal government to have to balance their budget the way households have to balance their budgets, the way states have to balance their budgets, and that is with a capital budget. I have a capital budget, means I have a mortgage on my house. I even have another capital budget. I've borrowed money to send my kids to college. I have a capital budget. Well, I don't have a capital budget in my car, but most people, when they buy a new car, have a capital budget. I meet that by paying, as everyone does, and the states do, paying on the monthly, in my case, in the states yearly, the cost of that borrowing and the principal. We pay it down, we pay it off. But the federal budget, as this amendment, would not allow that. Now, Governor Mike Leavitt of Utah, a prime supporter of enacting the balanced budget amendment, testified before the Judiciary Committee that his state has a capital budget provision and recommended that we look further into the question before enacting H.R. Res. 1. My own governor, Governor Tom Carper, former congressman of 10 years here in Washington, the strongest supporter of my delegation for a balanced budget amendment, a Democrat, told our Constitutional Subcommittee the same thing last year. But despite that good advice, this balanced budget amendment does not follow that almost universal practice of capital budgets because it fails to set up a separate capital budget for major physical improvements. It will surely mean less of those improvements, or we'll make those improvements and we will further cut in other areas of the budget or raise taxes in other areas of the budget, which will cause great pain when the more reasonable way to do it would be to do it the way the states and households do it. After all, if families couldn't borrow to pay for their house, there would be many fewer homeowners, and if states couldn't borrow to build their roads, there would be many fewer roads. Why enact a balanced budget amendment that fails to distinguish between projects that merit long-term financing and those that should be funded from year to year? Under this balanced budget amendment, the incentive will be to focus only on those spending priorities that have short-term payoffs economically and politically. That's not real good for rebuilding the infrastructure of this country, which we all say we have to do to compete internationally. Because that's where the political pressure will come. If in my state they come to me and say, why don't you vote to spend more money for the Corps of Engineers that will allow them to dredge the river and dredge the Delaware River and the port of Wilmington? Why don't you do that versus, by the way, you have to choose by spending more money to do that or spending more money for drug treatment programs? I know when I hear a mallet going down, I can tell it. I yield to the President, obviously.
Under the previous order, the hour 12:30 having arrived, the Senate will stand in recess until the hour 2:15
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent, unless there's a standing rule for the leader, that I be able to take 10 more minutes to finish my statement since the conference is underway, unless someone objects to that.
Is there objection?
I don't want to. Is that?
Without objection.
We used to do that in the bad old days when the Democrats.
Without objection.
Controlled. Thank you very much. Without a capital budget provision, I fear this amendment could skew the way in which we spend money, and in a way that could hurt long-term future investments this country needs. It doesn't have to be this way. In committee, I offered an amendment to provide for a capital budget. It was modeled on the capital budget provisions of the states, including my own state of Delaware. My amendment established a capital budget for major public physical investments. It limited that budget to 10% of total outlays, about what the federal government has spent on such items in recent years. I'd even go further, and it required a 3/5 vote of both houses to place any item within that capital budget. I will introduce a similar budget, and I will even go further and put a total limit on what the total accumulated debt can be for capital expenditures. My amendment was not designed to build a loophole into a balanced budget amendment. Under my amendment, it would not be easier to treat an item as a capital budget item as opposed to a current item. It would be harder, but that would be right. It would require a 3/5 vote. My amendment failed. Without a capital budget, I fear that not right away, but as the years go by, this amendment may skew the way the country invests for the future, and we may not be able to balance our budget in the end. A third concern about this balanced budget amendment is that the way it relates this amendment, it relates to the way this amendment treats a program that is arguably the most important and most dependent upon program in the federal government. I'm talking about Social Security, Mr. President. As we all know, the Social Security Trust Fund is designed to spread costs over many years of caring for working people after they retire. We pay in today so that 10 or 20 or 40 or 50 years from now, we can live out our lives knowing that we have that minimum Social Security payment. The Social Security Fund is not supposed to be in balance every year or even every 10 years. It is meant to be balanced over the decades. As this generation of working people pays its Social Security taxes, the Social Security Trust Fund is gathering in a surplus of tens of billions of dollars because the presiding officer and myself and others are of a generation that is the baby boom generation, or just before that generation. We pay in tens of billions of dollars in excess of what is drawn down by present Social Security recipients, my mom and dad, and my uncles and aunts. So there is a surplus of $100 billion will be paid in more than is taken out around the year 2000. $100 billion surplus. Right now, I'll ask my staff, what is it this year roughly? 60. It's $60 billion more is paid in this year by those of us paying our FICA tax than is paid out to Social Security recipients. $60 billion. Now, my mom and dad think that money goes into an account. They think that's over there for Social Security. A lot of people in my generation who in 20 years, and unfortunately less time than that, in 15 years will be eligible for Social Security. A lot of them think that money's being put in an account. But guess what, folks? We are spending it. We are spending it now. But before the year 2014, that Social Security Trust Fund will have generated a great surplus. But after 2014, we'll have substantial deficits. And the reason for it is that baby boom generation will be collecting Social Security. And my sons and daughter will be paying into it. There are fewer of them than there are of us. So fewer people will be paying in and more people will be taking out. Sounds like I'm stating what is obvious to everyone, but it's not obvious to everyone, obviously. The fact of the matter is, after the year 2014, we will be in deficit in the Social Security system. The balanced budget amendment makes no provision whatsoever for the unique characteristics of the Social Security Trust Fund. Instead, it treats Social Security revenues and outlays as ordinary federal budget. This means in the years that Social Security is generating hundreds of billions of dollars in surplus revenues, it will be used to cover hundreds of billions of dollars worth of deficits that the rest of the federal budget is creating. After 2014, when the trust fund goes into deficit to the tune of tens or hundreds of billions of dollars a year, we in Congress will have to cut that much from the rest of the budget to make up for the deficit. And what does it mean? It means that for the next 20 years or so, revenues from Social Security Trust Fund will make it look like we have balanced the budget when in fact we haven't. And after that, the huge outlays from the trust fund will force drastic reductions in the rest of federal spending or drastic reductions in Social Security. And that means the pain of cutting that we all know will be delayed by years from the effective date of this amendment. So we should get Social Security out of this mix. Make it clear that the balanced budget amendment does not deal with Social Security. It does not able to use the surpluses and not deal with the deficits. We should be more honest about it with people, because Social Security is at stake, in my view. For all the reasons I've stated, I supported Senator Feinstein's amendment in the committee to keep the Social Security right where it is now, off of budget. The Feinstein amendment recognizes that Social Security is not designed to balance its budget every year, but over the years. And it recognizes that we cannot honestly balance the rest of our federal budget if Social Security and its use swings are included. And it recognizes that Social Security is a unique institution that deserves unique protection. The fourth concern I have is this amendment will shift power to the large states at the expense of small states. By imposing supermajority requirements of 3/5 on both houses, it permits a minority of 2/5 plus 1 to block an unbalanced amendment, no matter how necessary for our fiscal and economic health it may be. This minority veto could be marshaled by representatives of just the 5 largest states in America. If the 5 largest states in America get together and agree on something that they need, the rest of the 45 states don't want, they can prevent us from acting on a national emergency by all of them voting as a bloc. Just 5 of our 50 states. The fifth and final concern is that nothing in this amendment forces Congress to begin the work of cutting the budget before the year 2002, the first year will be required. And what will happen when Congress tries to balance the budget all of a sudden in fiscal year 2002? I fear it will be rendered useless or render an economic disaster. This amendment ought to have some mechanism to guarantee that our government and our economy moves towards a balanced budget on a glide path, a gradual descent in the deficit that will get us to a balanced budget without forcing a crash landing in the final year. But this amendment does not do that. It's possible it could be done by enabling legislation, but I'd sure like to see it. Mr. President, in the days ahead, I and my colleagues will be offering amendments to address these and other legitimate concerns. I hope these amendments receive the full debate they deserve, and there are none in this body who will argue that an amendment to the Constitution is not worthy to receive the full and open debate that it will get. Under the watchful eyes of our forefathers and with the humility that this awesome task engenders, as the debate unfolds in the days to come, I will listen to my colleagues, I will support amendments designed to improve this amendment, and I will urge my colleagues to do the same. And I hope at the end of the process I will be able to do what I intend on doing now, and that is vote for a balanced budget amendment. I thank the chair for its indulgence and my colleagues as well, and I yield the floor.